Hi, welcome back to Lost in Translation, the series where we look at key biblical words that have lost something of their meaning by virtue of their being translated from one language to another, one culture to another, one place and time to another, also one literary context to another. The word I want to focus on today is the word lestes, which we commonly translate in the Bible thief. In our church's sanctuary, at the very front and center, above the table for communion, there are three crosses, and this is obviously these three crosses are the symbol of our church. We kind of made it a brand where our literature will feature these three crosses. And I always think of this word when I look at those crosses. In fact, my son, when we take communion together, my son is on the spectrum. He's autistic, and he likes to have very concrete facts before him, and it helps to have concrete images and concrete pictures and so forth. So we will use those three crosses when we take communion. I'll ask him a series of questions about the death, burial, and resurrection and ascension, second coming of Jesus. And one of the questions is, whom was Jesus crucified between? And he will often point on our little worship handout to the three crosses, and he'll point to the left one and the right one. He'll say, two thieves. He has a little lisp, so he says, two thieves. And I always say, that's right, that's right. But there's a part of me that knows that's not right. That Jesus was not crucified between two thieves. Um, that the word there, lestes, while it does commonly mean thief, it also had a range of connotations. And in the ancient world, particularly the Greek, this word as it was used in first century Palestine, it not only meant thief or robber, it came to mean insurrectionist or rebel, someone who is committed to violently overthrowing the Roman government. And the traditional translation of this through the centuries has always been thieves. I think that's part of it. You have kind of the inertia of a word having been translated for thousands and thousands of years. I suspect this goes back to at least to Jerome's Vulgate. Um, but it makes a lot more sense if you translate it insurrectionist, first of all. So at the level of language, it can mean insurrectionist, doesn't have to, it can mean thief. But when you put it back in terms of history, in first century Judaism, in first century rather Greco-Roman world, you the Romans did not crucify people who were found guilty of theft. They reserved crucifixion only for the lowest of the low, and among those who were crucified by the Romans were insurrectionists. So just that historical fact makes it more likely that Jesus was crucified between two insurrectionists. Now, why even discuss this? Because when you translate it that way in its original literary context, both in Matthew and in Mark, I'm going to focus on Mark, but this is also true of Matthew. I think there's something really rich gained that has been lost by virtue of this word having for centuries been translated thieves. There's a rich irony of Jesus being crucified between two rebels, two insurrectionists, that points us to the nature of Jesus himself, to the nature of Jesus's reign, his kingdom, and also to the nature of discipleship. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through. We're going to take Mark as an example. This would also be true of Matthew. I want to walk you through Mark's use of this word. Mark uses it a couple of at least two critical times. There's three occurrences of the word. I'm going to focus on the two critical ones at the end of the gospel. But to do that, I want to set up what Mark is doing in the early chapters before we arrive at these latter chapters where the word appears, and then we'll step back and say, okay, what's gained by translating this word as insurrectionists instead of robbers? Why should my son know that Jesus was crucified between two insurrectionists? Why is that important? So, in the Gospel of Mark is very much interested in the identity of Jesus. That's the theme that runs through Mark is who is Jesus? From the very beginning, we as readers are told he is the Messiah. He's the Christ. The Messiah or the Christ was the expected end time Davidic king of the Jews through whom God would exercise his good reign over all creation. Most Jewish groups were expecting the Messiah. No, we as readers are told he's the Messiah. But when Jesus begins preaching the reign of God, the coming reign of God, which was the center of his message, he says nothing about himself being the Messiah. And right out of the gate, we see that Jesus is trying to keep this his identity as a Messiah actually a secret. Scholars refer to this as the Messianic secret of Mark. Throughout the first half of the gospel and on into the second half, for much of the gospel, Jesus is keeping his messiahship a secret. And we as readers are left kind of wondering why. We see this right out of the gate. The very first scene in Capernaum after Jesus has called followers, he goes into a synagogue and he casts out a demon of a man, an unclean spirit, a demon of the man in the synagogue. And the demon starts to announce who Jesus is. I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. You are the Holy One of God. That's a messianic title. And Jesus rebukes him and commands him to be silent. We go, what? He's not telling a lie, Jesus. Why are you? It would seem to be kind of in your interest to let the demons, as you're casting them out, tell everybody you're the Messiah. But Jesus does not want that demon to speak. Very next scene, we go into the house in Capernaum. Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus raises her from her sickness. And we're told that the townspeople started to gather at the gate of the house. And while they're there, Jesus begins to heal the sick and cast out demons. And Mark tells us he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew who he was, which is interesting. Evidently, Jesus does not want his identity known. And not only that, evidently the demons do want his identity known. Why do the demons want everybody to know he's the Messiah? He's the expected king through whom God will reign over all the nations. Why do the demons want that knowledge out there, and why does Jesus not want it out there? A little bit later in that same chapter, Jesus heals a leper who's kind of a faithless leper, doesn't trust that Jesus wills to do the good, and he ignores Jesus's commands after he heals him. Anyways, in that same scene, Jesus rebukes that leper and also tells him to say nothing to no one about having healed him. So he rebukes and silences the leper, just like he rebukes and silences the demons. Fast forward to chapter 3. We're told that Jesus is repeatedly healing the sick and casting out demons, and he's consistently rebuking the demons sternly and telling them to remain silent. When we get into the next chapter, Jesus raises the little girl, Jairus' daughter, from the dead. He doesn't let anyone see this, except for Peter, James, and John and the family. And he lets everybody think that the girl was literally asleep and not dead, when actually she was just figuratively asleep. Death is nothing more than sleep for the faithful, right? So, and he tells the family not to say anything about this. He is keeping his identity and power as Messiah a secret. And the effect of this in the first half of the Gospel of Mark is nobody knows who he is except the demons. His family, in chapter 3, they think he's crazy. The religious leaders think he's possessed by Beelzebul. Herod reports that the crowds think that he is either Elijah or John the Baptist raised from the dead or one of the prophets. The disciples, who get to see everything, including Peter, James, and John, for the first half of the gospel, they don't know he's the Messiah. When he calms the storm, the disciples are pictured faithless and fearful and asking, who then is this who stills wind and wave? Who then is this who controls wind and wave? They don't know who he is. Only the demons know for the first half of the gospel. Now, all of this changes when we get to chapter 8. And it's at that point that the 12, they've already been on their mission, they've been around Jesus, they've seen everything. It's at this point that Jesus asks them, who do the crowds say that I am? And they report, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're one of the prophets. So Jesus' secrecy has still been effective. No one knows who he is. We're still wondering why he's being secret, but Jesus has been successful. The demons have failed. No one knows who he is. But now Jesus turns to the 12. He says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter, speaking for the 12, says, you are the Messiah. So this is Supposedly, it seems like, this is the moment where the disciples, the one group that have been allowed to see everything, Jesus seems to want them to be able to figure this out. They figured it out. They know who he is. They know he's the Messiah. We are now ready for all things to be as they should. Right when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus rebukes him and rebukes them and says, and commands them to tell no one that he's the Messiah. And we're left wondering why. I think it's at this point in the story that we begin to get a sense of why. Right when the 12 figure out he's the Messiah, it's at that moment that Jesus begins to teach for the very first time in the gospel that he will suffer and die in Jerusalem and be raised from the dead. And this is as they've just begun their journey to Jerusalem. So from chapter 8 to the end, through to chapter 16, all the rest of the story is concerned about going to Jerusalem or being in Jerusalem. And as they're journeying, this is the first of three passion predictions. 3 times Jesus will predict his death. 3 times the disciples are going to show that they hilariously don't understand what he's talking about all this dying. That in fact, their minds are in a very different place, a very dark place. And then 3 times Jesus will correct them with paradoxical teaching. So here in this first passion prediction, Jesus says, I'm going to die. And right when he says that, Peter takes him aside and Peter rebukes him, which is ironic because Jesus has been rebuking the demons and the faithless healed and the sea. And now Peter's treating Jesus like a demon. He's rebuking Jesus. Well, Jesus rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan, for you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. That is interesting. Why is Peter rebuking Jesus? Why is Peter saying, yeah, you're the Messiah, but I rebuke you for all this talk of dying? Well, the most likely answer, and I think as we get into Mark, this answer is further confirmed, is that Peter, like many, arguably most Jewish people who look forward to the kingdom of God and his Messiah coming, believed that Messiah would come by overthrowing the Romans in a militaristic insurrection. That they would lead a great rebellion and overthrow the Romans. And right when Jesus has just had this moment with his disciples where they figured out he's the Messiah, right then he begins to immediately teach he must die, he must suffer and die and then be raised from the dead. This does not fit Peter's understanding of what a Messiah should be. It does, however, fit Satan's understanding if Jesus' words are to be trusted, right? Jesus basically accuses Peter in his mindset of thinking like thinking like Satan, thinking like humans, and not having in mind the things of God. So Peter has hilariously misunderstood the first passion prediction. It's at that moment that Jesus calls the crowds and he says, look, if you want to be my followers, take up your cross and follow me. And here's the paradox. If you want to save your life, those who want to save their lives are going to lose it. But if you want to gain your life, you'll lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you will gain it. And so he calls his disciples to join him in powerlessness, in losing their life alongside him. So there's already this disconnect right when Jesus first predicts his passion between the militaristic, insurrectionist goals of his disciples and what Jesus is going to instead, and what he's calling them to instead. Instead of calling them to kill Romans, he's calling them to join him in dying at the hands of Romans. And somehow this is going to usher in the reign of God. Second passion prediction as they journey to Jerusalem, he again says, and this is in chapter 9, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, I'll be raised from the dead. And again, the disciples hilariously misunderstand what he's talking about. Immediately, he catches them arguing about who's the greatest. Now think about this. They are going to Jerusalem. They think they've found the Messiah, and they are not getting that this Messiah is saying he's going to die. They are imagining they're going to Rome to lead a rebellion. And so when they're arguing about who's the greatest, they mean this in political terms. They are thinking, I am the one who deserves to be next to Jesus on the throne. I am the one who is going to be ruling. So again, Jesus corrects them with paradoxical teaching. It was earlier, it was if you want to gain your life, you'll lose it. Now, he says to them, if you want to be first, you will be last and servant of all. And he takes up a child. And in the ancient world, a child was not a symbol of innocence like we always treat it in this scene. The child was the lowest of the low. He was the least of all, the last of all. In Greco-Roman society, children had fewer rights than women and slaves, and women and slaves had it really bad. You could do horrible things to a slave. You could not kill a slave. That's still murder without justification. You could kill your own child. It was a common practice of you have a child that's disabled or has mental disabilities, or you don't want the child for any reason. The child is small. It was a common practice for people to just abandon their children in the wilderness. It was called exposing children. And it was actually Christianity that ended the practice when the Roman Empire in the years after Constantine became Christian, that practice came to an end. It was common, though, in the Greco-Roman world. Children were non-persons in the eyes of the law. Quite literally, they were not protected by laws against murder. So when Jesus holds up this child and he tells the disciples, I want you to welcome such as these, he means the least of all, the last of all. He means the lowest of the low. And he even says, when you welcome such as these into your midst, you welcome me into your midst. And when you welcome me, you welcome God. In other words, God's presence is mediated by the lowest among us. When we welcome the least and the lowest among us, we're welcoming God into our midst. That we must have the least and lowest among us, otherwise God's not present among us. So Jesus is saying all that to underscore what is correction, his paradoxical correction. You want to be first of all, you disciples who are arguing over who's the greatest? You want to be first? You want to be first in my kingdom? Be last of all and be servant of all. They're imagining not being servants, but being lords in a political sense. They're imagining having power over other people because they're following the king. They think they're best friends with the guy that's going to be running everything. And this king is saying, I'm dying. I'm calling you to die with me. Take up your cross and follow me. I'm calling you to be last of all and servant of all with me. Well, then we get to the third passion prediction. Again, Jesus, and in greater specificity than he has to this point, the third time he predicts his passion, they're going to spit upon me. They're going to beat me, and they're going to kill me, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead. Right when he predicts his passion the third time, James and John pull him aside and say, we want you to do whatever it is we ask of you. And Jesus says, what is it you ask? And James and John say, we want to sit on your right hand and on your left hand when you come into your glory. So, what are they asking? They're basically saying we want to be, coming into your glory means coming into your power, coming into your dominion. They're basically saying when you become king, when we get to Jerusalem and we kill all these Romans and we lead a successful insurrection, we want to be on your right hand and your left hand. In the ancient throne room, the second and third in power in a kingdom were on the right and left hand of the king. They're basically asking to be vice president and secretary of state in a kingdom. They're the second and third powers. And when the other 10 of the 12 hear this, they're jealous and they're angry with James and John. Well, anyways, what Jesus says to them is interesting. He says, you don't know what you're asking. And it's at this point that you and I as readers of Mark are supposed to think of the two crosses on either side of Jesus. They don't know that what they're really asking is to die with him on the cross. They think they're asking, can we be, Lord number 2 and Lord number 3 in your kingdom? But what they've actually unknowingly asked is, can they be on the cross to Jesus' right and the cross to Jesus' left? Because that is the moment when Jesus is going to come into his glory. That is the moment when he will become king of the world, when he dies on the cross. So Jesus says to James and John, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I will be baptized? He's using the language of the post-Easter community of Eucharist and baptism, both rites wherein the believer joins Jesus in his death. He's using the language of these rites to say, can you die with me? And they say, yes, we can. We can do it. And then Jesus says, well, it's not for me to appoint who is on my left or on my right. That's up to God. And this is foreshadowing the scene where we have the two, I'm going to say insurrectionists when we get there. The two insurrectionists crucified on the other side. So, he's predicted his passion 3 times, and then he corrects James and John by saying to them, you know how the Gentiles in their kingdoms, their kings are lords and tyrants. They lord it over the people. They're tyrants over the people. Not so with you. In my kingdom, I want you to be last of all and slave of all. Whoever wants to be first is going to be last and slave of all. There's the paradoxical correction again. This time he uses the word slave. They are imagining being lords and tyrants, and he's calling them to be slaves, the opposite end of the political spectrum. Slaves on behalf of others. So the journey's over. At this point, a blind man confesses Jesus as Son of David, a Messianic title, and we expect Jesus to rebuke him and silence him. Instead, Jesus' disciples rebuke him and silence him, and Jesus welcomes the man, which is a way of accepting his confession. For the first time, Jesus is not silencing someone who's publicly confessing him as Messiah. This is the moment in Mark when Jesus accepts the public acclamation of himself as king. He's finished predicting his suffering as a Messiah, his death as a Messiah. Now he's prepared to accept the public acclamation. Then they go into Jerusalem, very next scene, and the city seems to have figured out for the first time he's the Messiah, and they welcome him as a conquering king. And Jesus lets them because he is the king. But the crowd this is at the Feast of Pentecost. They are in a feverish pitch, as was often the case at the Feast of Pentecost. These Jews who are welcoming him, these Jewish crowds who are welcoming him as Jesus, are understandably angry at the Romans, and they're thirsty for insurrection, and they think this is the guy that will lead them. Well, the religious leaders' response, the religious leadership in Jerusalem and the political leadership, the Jewish political and religious leadership, they were kind of more in bed with the Romans, and they don't want insurrection. So they follow through on the plot to have Jesus arrested. Fast forward to the scene of Gethsemane, and this is the first occurrence of our word. Well, it's the first critical occurrence of our word lestes in the Gospel of Mark. At the scene of Gethsemane, after Jesus has prayed his prayer, we're told in Mark that a group of men came carrying swords and clubs to arrest Jesus. And Jesus immediately calls them on this. He says, why are you coming out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a lestes? Now, some of our translations will translate that robber. But it makes much more sense if the other meaning of this word, the meaning that this word had attained in first century Judaism especially, that meaning is used. Why do you come out to arrest me as though I am an insurrectionist? And let's be clear, nobody suspects Jesus of being a thief. What the crowds want him to be, what his own disciples want him to be is an insurrectionist, and what the leadership is concerned he might be is an insurrectionist, and they are going out to him. And why send a whole group of men who are armed with weapons of war, clubs and swords to arrest him? Because they think Jesus is an insurrectionist and his followers are insurrectionists. And they're not entirely wrong. His followers in their minds are. What does one of the guys who's around Jesus do when they come to arrest him? The guy draws his sword in defense of Jesus. What is one of Jesus's followers doing carrying a sword, to Jerusalem? Jesus has been saying, I'm going there to die and I'm calling you to die with me on a cross. Why is one of Jesus's followers bringing a sword with the guy thinks he's an insurrectionist along with Jesus? Fast forward to the scene of the trial before Pilate. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Again, that's a question you ask if you think he is an insurrectionist. Pilate's not questioning him over being a thief. He's questioning Jesus over whether or not you're claiming to be king instead of Caesar. And Jesus says, "You say so." Well, Pilate doesn't think he's guilty, so Pilate thinks he has an out. He has a custom where he can release someone on the feast day so that the crowds may choose. And he's hoping the crowds will release Jesus because he does not think Jesus is guilty of insurrection. But the religious leadership stirs up the crowd and talks the crowd into calling for the release of Barabbas. And this is I think the first of a series of great ironies in Mark. It's at this point that the crowd asks for the release of Barabbas, and Barabbas is, we're told by Mark, was an insurrectionist who had committed murder along with other in an insurrection. So Mark says he's an insurrectionist who committed murder in an insurrection. And his name, Barabbas, means son of the Father. So the great irony is Jesus is wrongly convicted. Jesus, though he's Son of God, is wrongly convicted of insurrection, and the crowds choose in his place to release an actual insurrectionist who only had the name Son of God. That central cross should have had Barabbas on it, but instead it had the true Barabbas, the true Son of God. Barabbas means Son of God, who was not at all guilty of insurrection. So, very next scene is the crucifixion. I want to end on this. The crucifixion is told like a Roman enthronement scene. In Roman imperial times, when a new emperor was crowned, there was a parade. It would begin at the palace, the imperial palace, and the Praetorian Guard would hail the emperor to be as king. Then there would be a parade to the streets, and the parade would feature the king to be, and there was also going to be a sacrifice at the top of the hill where they were going. So they would parade the instrument that's going to be used to slaughter the sacrificial animal. Then they would go up the hill, the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and at the top of this hill, they would have a sacrifice, and wine would be poured out. And at the moment of the sacrifice, the king, the emperor to be, would be hailed as both emperor and king and as a divinity, a son of God. Well, you may recognize that what Mark is doing just by my narrating what a Roman enthronement scene. Mark tells the crucifixion scene like a Roman enthronement scene. It begins at the palace with the Roman soldiers mocking him, putting purple robes on him, a crown of thorns, and then, beating and spitting on him. Why are they mad at him? They think he's an insurrectionist. And then they parade him through the streets. This is like when the emperor's in a parade, and they parade the cross behind him. Simon of Cyrene is carrying the cross. That's the instrument used for the sacrifice. They get to the top of the hill. The hill's called Golgotha, which actually means place of the head, not place of the skull. Place of the head evokes the name Capitoline Hill, where Roman emperors were enthroned. At the top of the hill, there are placards proclaiming Jesus king. This would have been like the placards at the top of Capitoline Hill. There's wine, myrrhed wine, which myrrh was for the kings. Myrrhed wine is offered. And then a sacrifice is made. Jesus is both the sacrificial animal and the king. And we're told somewhat climactically in Mark that he was crucified between two, and the word here is lestes, two insurrectionists. The irony being that Jesus was himself wrongly convicted of insurrection, and yet he's crucified between an insurrectionist on his left and an insurrectionist on his right. Now, I think there's another irony here, in addition to the irony that's being underscored of Jesus' innocence. He's wrongly convicted of insurrection, he's crucified among other insurrectionists. In addition to that irony, at the moment of his death, darkness comes over the face of the earth, and a Roman soldier witnessing this says, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Ironically, not through killing, but through dying, does Jesus extract the confession of faith from a Roman soldier. All his disciples had come with swords on their hips ready to kill Roman soldiers, and Jesus, in dying, evokes from this Roman soldier a confession of faith. Truly this man was the Son of God. I think that's the other irony that's lost when we translate this word lestes as thief. When we say Jesus was crucified between two thieves, I think we're missing Mark's point. But when we say Jesus was crucified between two insurrectionists, this richer irony is underscored, that actually in his dying, Jesus was leading an insurrection. In his dying, Jesus was bringing a new kingdom in place of the old, one that's contrasted with the tyrants and the lords of the Gentiles. The kingdom that Jesus ushers in is a kingdom of peace, a kingdom of nonviolence, a kingdom where the subjects are not seeking to be greatest of all, first of all. They're not seeking to lord it over all. They're not seeking to save their lives. They are becoming least of all, last of all, servant of all, slave of all, for the sake of the world. And they're taking up their crosses and following Jesus. So ironically, it's appropriate that Jesus is hailed as king and is hailed as Son of God. And the placards say, King of the Jews, that he wears a crown, that he's dressed in purple. It's ironically appropriate that he has another insurrectionist on his left and another on his right, because he truly was, in a sense, leading an insurrection, a non-violent, non-militaristic, but certainly an insurrection that establishes a physical kingdom on earth with subjects committed to the same ideals and principles.